I think there was a movement where people were trying to use Filipinx, right, to be more, gender inclusive. My understanding is that like it was kind of taking what was applied to Latino and Latina and applying Latinx, right, but applying that same kind of logic to Filipino or to Filipino, Filipina, right, and just saying Filipinx. But there was apparently like Filipino in its origin is gender, I believe, gender neutral, and so there was kind of a discussion on whether it should be referred to as Filipinx or just Filipino. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not Filipino, but that's what I've read in terms of the backstory behind it.
You got it right, Mike. And I'd say that bringing up the kind of treatment of Latino or Latina to Latinx is, I think, the right way to go too. And to just kind of cover the bases there, even that is in kind of contention, right? Where there are some people who are like, why are we using an X in Latinx? This just feels like, again, another kind of Eurocentric or white-centric way of trying to identify people who are either of the Latin identity by using a Western way to do it. Why can't we use something that feels more like within the cultural context? So there are some people who opt for Latine versus Latinx, and that and I think to now consider what is it for Filipinos and Filipinx versus Filipino and Filipina. I mean, it is gender neutral when we consider the pronouns within Tagalog or Filipino. Siya is used as the pronoun. There is no he or her, which is why if you're Filipino and listening to this or understand some Tagalog or hear it, Filipinos of an older generation often get mixed up between he and her or him and hers because you do not have to change the pronoun when you're speaking in the language. And so having to do that within English is takes some mental energy and code switching really. Now to do then like Filipina and Filipino, well, I don't know actually the history of this. My best guess is the introduction of the Spanish gendering, and when Spain conquered the Philippines, this is where the kind of this distinction has come from. But Filipino itself, for many Filipinos who either live in the diaspora or within the Philippines, this is how they identify. So Filipinx feels like a disruption or a departure from what actually feels authentic for them, which is, I am Filipino, whether I identify as a woman or a man or trans or however, Filipino does encompass my identity. I think where I stand on this is allow the individual to identify it for themselves, but don't impose what you think the label should be. And this gets tricky because Filipinx is like, in my case, I'm using it to label an entire month for the purposes of celebrating it at the company that I work at. But does that mean if I use it that it can't be Filipino or it can't be Filipina? And it started some healthy dialogue, I think. But this is where I think we have to be able to engage with that conversation and respect what an individual might want, and for them to entertain and accept their dissent about it. I don't have a particular stance on it. I think when I talk about it, I say both, and I offer it as offerings for the language. When I talk about when I talk about Filipino stuff, depending on my audience, I might be like Filipino or Filipinx, and I'll share both as options, so that I acknowledge that there's maybe some people who identify with one label or the other, and it also just opens the conversation and allows for some education.
I think that's a very inclusive approach, right? That the intent behind that is showing consideration, right, for potentially joining viewpoints, right? Because like essentially they could be opposing viewpoints, but by acknowledging both, right, it's also validating. Let's say like we acknowledge that these are two viewpoints that can coexist, together. And I wonder if, like, because Filipinx is probably a newer term, right, to use to try to be more broadly inclusive. I almost feel, and obviously correct me if I'm wrong, or if you have a differing viewpoint, it's almost like it's a label to almost like it's a sociological label, right? It's like, how do you define like not an era, right? But just like a broad term. But then, a broad term versus what's used personally, right? Or how you identify personally. I still think that's up to the person, like you said. So I wonder if it's just more of like it's a broad term to almost generically label because someone needs, right, to be able to describe a certain set of feelings or a status or a condition of a person, right, that maybe wasn't necessarily represented in both words. And there's probably arguments you said like it doesn't need to be, but maybe there are some people that feel like uh, there just isn't that one word, right, to really describe a broader phenomenon, with a kind of introduction of a new word. So that's kind of where I can sort of see where the origins are coming from. But yeah, just that was just my take, like, on it.
I agree with your take. It's this generation's attempt at making sense of what they have, right? I think language will always be imperfect, and it's trying things out.
I mean, language changes over time, right? Like, you look at TikTok, right? Like, God, new words come up all the time. New language comes up all the time. Changes every 2 weeks, maybe a week if we're lucky. Uh, I know I'm joking around, but I'm also like half serious about it as well. Just as a millennial, trying to just keep up with Gen Z language and lingo. I think, yeah, like language changes, and you know, like you mentioned, I think you might have mentioned before, right? Like words and terms that exist now for a new generation, for more representation, and stuff with good intent, right? You take that to your grandparents or whoever, they may have no concept of it whatsoever, and a language sometimes becomes generational, like at that point.
Right. Yep. And we have to make space for it all.